Hello and welcome to the NOAA Climate Change Short Course. I'm David Herring, Director of Communications and Education within NOAA's Climate Program Office. And on behalf of NOAA and our partners in the Oceanic Lifelong Learning Institute, it's a pleasure to bring you this lineup of world-class climate science experts to give an overview on our modern understanding of Earth's climate system. In today's session, we're going to hear from Dr. Mathew Nisbet, a leading social scientist at American University based in Washington, D.C. Dr. Nisbet has authored over 35 peer-reviewed articles in scholarly journals documenting the state of knowledge and attitudes and perceptions among the public about climate change. In today's session, Dr. Nisbet is going to lead us on a fascinating exploration of how we might reframe public discourse to move beyond tired debates in the public media about whether or not climate change is happening, and much more with an emphasis on how we might leverage the modern understanding and modern science in ways that are empowering in people's lives, in ways that can save lives, that can promote economic growth, that can save valuable natural resources. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mathew Nisbet in his presentation titled Reframing Climate Change Dialogue to Reconcile Expert and Public Perceptions.
It's great to be here with you today. I'm looking forward to your comments and your questions at the end of my presentation. At the bottom of the screen there, those of you that might have had the chance to go down to the National Smithsonian Portrait Gallery might have seen the Norman Rockwell exhibit that was there last year. And I put this image of one of Norman Rockwell's two town meeting portraits or portrayals that he did on the screen for a reason. One is, as I'll be talking about today, the ethos, the tradition of the public town meeting is very important as we move forward and think about climate change communication and how to widen the scope of public participation about the problem and around solutions. The other interesting thing about Norman Rockwell, the exhibit that was at the Smithsonian, was paintings that were owned by Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, our two most famous filmmakers. In a documentary that they had at the Smithsonian, I think it was George Lucas who said that one of the reasons why that he found Norman Rockwell so compelling and started to collect his paintings is that he viewed Norman Rockwell as if he was a filmmaker. He was able to tell a story in a single frame and to set through a single frame of reference an entire story about what was going on, the characters there, and what was happening. And that's something I'm also going to be talking about today, is the power of storytelling and the frame of reference for understanding how to organize public discussion and participation around the many dimensions related to climate change. So, as many of you know, following this issue, and it's probably been talked about in some of the presentations, is that we continue to have a public opinion challenge on climate change that relates obviously to our goals in communicating with the public and widening the scope of participation on the issue. Following the news, you probably know that, for example, since 2006 and 2007, when Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out as a documentary film, and there was a tremendous amount of media attention to the problem of climate change, that in fact, actually in public opinion polls, public concern and belief in climate change has actually taken a downturn. Fewer people today are concerned about climate change and believe in climate change than they did in 2006 and 2007. And as many of you also probably know, there's a very wide gap between how strong Democrats, people who strongly identify as a Democrat, and people who strongly identify as Republican view both the reality and the causes of climate change. But even among Democrats, when you poll Democrats and you ask them how much of a priority is climate change relative to other issues, climate change still ranks at the middle towards the bottom of policy issues that even Democrats who accept the science of climate change believe it's a problem, how they rank climate change relative to other policy concerns. Now that's the common portrayal that we have of public opinion, and what I want to open with is to show you a different type of depiction. This is the results of research that colleagues and collaborators of mine, Ed Maybach and Tony Lacerowitz, have done over the last couple of years. Ed is a professor at George Mason University and runs the Center for Climate Change Communication. What's interesting about these national level surveys is that instead of asking people single item questions about their views, their attitudes about climate change, they ask them roughly about 40 questions about their current attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and knowledge, And then based on their answers to those 40 questions, they statistically grouped them into 6 distinct audience segments. And these audience segments range from those on the left here who are very alarmed about the issue. They believe that climate change is a problem, they perceive it as a leading problem, and they're looking for information on how to get involved. And on the right, you have those that are strongly dismissive of the problem. They reject the scientific evidence for the issue, don't believe it's happening, and strongly oppose any type of policy action. What's interesting about this way of looking at public opinion, which I believe is a much more reliable and valid depiction of public opinion than relying on single poll questions or simply grouping the public by Democrat versus Republican, is begin to see the kind of the true continuum or range or diversity of views on this issue. The first thing is that we often tend to think about public opinion in a dichotomous way between people who accept the issue and are alarmed by it versus those who are strongly dismissive. And in that process, we tend to overestimate the proportion of the public who are truly dismissive of the problem. What Ed and Tony and their collaborators on the surveys find is that on average, really only about 15% of the public can you categorize as truly dismissive of the issue. Some people might call them deniers. On the other hand, the segment of the public that we tend to communicate most with, that we reach with most of our communication efforts, are this alarm segment. These are the people who are highly attentive and read the really good science and environment news and discuss the issue often, but they are really only about 15% of the public. Now, what's also interesting about these trends that have been taken over time is that you see sort of the ebb and flow of where the public might break out on this continuum. You can see from 2008, which is very close to really the high end of public belief and concern with climate change in 2006 and 2007, about 18% were in the alarmed category versus only 7% in the dismissive category. Over time, we can see that the category in the alarm section has declined. People have sort of shifted towards the middle in terms of these other views about climate change. And then the dismissive category grew to about 16% in 2010. And then the last time it was surveyed, and again, there's error bars around these estimates, it was about 12%. So we see some shifting, some ebb and flow in how the public views the problem. What I'm going to argue today is that though we tend to focus our communication efforts in popular discussion in terms of how do we convince these people on the dismissive side or on the doubtful side, how do we change their minds about the problem of climate change? Or we only end up communicating to ourselves about the problem, those people who are strongly alarmed. What I'm going to argue today is the most important segments of the public to think about are these segments in the middle. And these range from people who are concerned about the issue, they accept that that's a problem and it's a concern, but they don't necessarily see it as a leading priority and they don't know what can be done about it, to people down here who are in the disengaged category, who before being called up on and asked about the issue on a survey may never even have thought about climate change before, have very little information, and are extremely ambivalent about the issue as whether or not it even applies to their daily lives. What's important about this disengaged segment is that this disengaged segment tends to be overwhelmingly low income and disproportionately minority in background. In this segment of the public, in many cases, the segment of the public that will be most impacted by things like the health impacts of climate change, something that I'm going to talk about a little bit later today. So I would argue that the goals of communication need to be to focus on these segments of the public and to understand how to communicate the relevance of climate change, to make it personally meaningful to them, and then how action would actually make their lives or the communities better, and then third, how to involve them in the process. How to get them actively involved so that their preferences, their voice, and their input is heard. And there's a lot of reasons why we should invest in wider public participation on the issue. And this is consistent with a lot of the research that's been done on other science and environmental issues about why public participation is important. First, just from a normative standpoint, in terms of how we think about democracy and decision-making, these issues related to climate and energy are too important to leave to experts, environmental groups, industry alone. That the public should be actively involved both at the national and the regional and the community level on what should be done about climate change and how to make it happen. The other thing we know about facilitating public participation is that it leads to innovation. It fuels a bottom-up process. Experts don't have all the answers, especially when it comes to tailoring approaches to climate change mitigation and adaptation or energy innovation and adoption at the local community levels where we really don't have a lot of, we have less research at the local community levels than we have at the national level, and we're going to have a lot of experimentation and a lot of trial and error in figuring out how different communities and regions can best cope with and manage climate change. And then finally, we also know from facilitating public participation, this is maybe by far the best way for the public to learn. Not only is it by far maybe the best way for the public to learn is if they can come out, participate in an event like this, and most importantly, as I'll talk about, engage in face-to-face interaction amongst yourselves and in interaction with a range of stakeholders and leaders. This is not only maybe the best way for the public to learn about the technical side of climate change, but also to learn about the social and the political consequences and the solutions of climate change. And importantly, as an outcome, apart from knowledge gain, it increases overall levels of trust, belief, feelings of efficacy among the public, that their voices have been consulted and that they can make a difference if they get involved, and also develops networks and relationships among members who are participating in these events and also the institutional sponsors. And all of those things are incredibly important in terms of building up community and regional capacity to manage and to deal with the impacts of climate change and seek out solutions. And then finally, public engagement and public participation increases transparency and accountability. For many of the different stakeholders and groups and institutions that have traditionally been involved in climate change, and the many other diversity of institutions and organizations and leaders that will participate on climate change over the coming decades. Okay, so there are a number of different causes for the decline in public concern and belief in climate change over time. This ebb and flow between people being in the left-hand side of this corner, being more alarmed, more concerned, and then shifting towards being more doubtful or more dismissive. In popular debate, we tend to focus on the influence, for example, of conservative media and conservative organizations who have tried to downplay the certainty of climate change and often exaggerate the economic costs. And certainly they've been a factor in contributing to public doubt over time. But one of the things that we overlook, and perhaps the most parsimonious explanation for simply why public opinion has changed since 2006 and 2007, is simply the economy. So this is a report that I released a couple of weeks ago. I'll talk about it at the end. You can find it at climateshiftproject.org. But one of the things in one of those chapters there, I try to look at what are the factors that have been shaping public opinion over time. And in my mind, the most parsimonious, the strongest factor has simply been the performance of the economy. What's often overlooked about 2006 and 2007 is that, in fact, 2006 and 2007, the light bars here are the levels of unemployment at the time that these surveys by Pew were taken in January of each year. These surveys map the perception of the economy as being a top policy priority versus the environment, or the lower light blue bar, global warming, in terms of action on global warming. What's often overlooked is that in 2006 and 2007, these were the lowest levels of unemployment for the last decade. You have to go back to 2000 to find levels of unemployment that are equal to 2006 and 2007. We know from a lot of research and risk communication that we have a limited pool of worry. When we're faced with a number of different threats or risks, we tend to be able to only focus on a few risks and not be able to account for all of them. The performance of the economy, especially the threat of maybe you losing your job or someone you know, is by far perhaps the greatest risk that the public has faced over the last couple of years, and certainly it's been the heaviest focus of both political debate and economic debate. Economists, for example, in looking at national survey trends on public opinion about climate change, find a very strong correlation between unemployment rates both at the state level and even at the county level between concern and the perceived priority of the issue. They've even looked at the relationship at a state level in terms of information seeking about climate change versus jobs via Google searches, and again find a very strong variation or relationship between the unemployment level in a state and people's information seeking about either climate change or jobs. As unemployment has gone up, fewer people seek out information about climate change, and the searching for information related to jobs, the economy, go way up. So one of the things that we've been dealing with, one of the structural barriers to wider public participation simply has been the economic situation, and that's also a communication barrier, because when you present people with policy solutions, if those policy solutions are easily perceived as leading to costs with little short-term benefits, then the initial reaction of the public is to argue against those solutions, and one of the ways they argue against those solutions is to reject that climate change is a problem, or to start to counter-argue against some of the scientific information. We tend to think about media content as also a barrier to public participation. One of the widely voiced claims about the mainstream media, even papers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, apart from the ideological centered media on the right, is that the media continues to engage in false balance about the fundamentals of climate science. Is climate change happening, and is it human caused? And one of the things I did in this report is I wanted to take a look at our trend-setting national newspapers and news organizations. Those national newspapers and news organizations that stakeholders, experts, and influentials read in 2009 and 2010 as we were debating what to do about climate change, both at the international level and the national level. And using quantitative content analysis, where 3 graduate students were trained to reliably and validly rate a sample of articles, one out of 4 articles at the Washington Post, the New York Times, Politico.com, CNN.com, and the Wall Street Journal, aggregating these results by 3-month period between 2009 and 2010. Across all of these 3-month periods, at least 7 out of 10 opinion and news articles at these 5 leading trend-setting news organizations featured the consensus view on the reality and causes of climate change. And really, it was only at the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal that you saw that these trend-setting news organizations veered away from the consensus view on climate change, and that's not surprising. The opinion page at the Wall Street Journal is consistent with a lot of research on News Corporation-owned news organizations like Fox News that tend to downplay the reality of climate change and dismiss any type of action. But what the difference, though, is that the news articles of the Wall Street Journal strongly reflected the consensus view. It was the opinion pages, the editorial pages, that was the source of either falsely balanced coverage or dismissive coverage. Now, certainly, the portrayals of climate change in the conservative media, political talk radio, and Fox News remain a problem. But as I'll talk about in a little bit, those audiences tend to be strongly self-selecting. The people who watch Fox News and listen to political talk radio already tend to be strongly doubtful or dismissive of climate change, and these media reach them and tend to reinforce their outlook. A different problem with the media that's often overlooked is not necessarily the content, but the amount of information available about climate change as a problem itself. One of the things that I looked at in this report was what was the pattern of attention at these national trend-setting newspapers during 2009 and 2010 as cap and trade and international agreement was being debated. And as you can see, this huge spike was in and around the Copenhagen meetings, the international agreement meetings that were held in December 2009. The other interesting thing I wanted to look at is to what degree, how much attention did the so-called event ClimateGate, this debate around surreptitiously released emails from East Anglia University in UK that revealed conversations among climate scientists, how much attention this controversy received? Well, in about 2009, December 2009, when the event broke, while Copenhagen was happening, about 20% of articles at these 5 news organizations mentioned the stolen emails. But after that, almost all of the coverage was at the opinion pages or at the Wall Street Journal, and the other news organizations did not follow up with the story. A bigger problem with the media, I would argue, is not necessarily its content and the fundamentals of climate science, but rather, as I mentioned, the amount of information that's provided. So after this major political focusing event, and this is consistent with patterns in coverage at the national level historically, where there's a huge spike in and around a major political focusing event like Copenhagen or like the Kyoto meetings in 1997. But in subsequent years, there's lower levels of attention to the issue, so climate change moves way down the overall news agenda. You can see that this happened in 2010. As cap and trade was being debated in the Senate, and as we're talking about other actions, solutions to climate change, the overall attention to climate change went way down. This is even a bigger problem at the regional and local newspapers and news organizations, which simply because of economic pressures don't have the capacity in terms of their staff and their journalists to adequately cover regional and local level impacts related to climate change and what might be the solutions in terms of mitigating and adapting to those impacts. And I'll come back to thinking about what solutions might be. So in this case, media coverage is not so much a content problem related to the science, though there's still more work to do in terms of thinking about how the media covers specific types of impacts, but it's more of a structural problem in terms of thinking about where is this content coming from? How are people in local communities at the regional level going to have the information they need to make decisions and to collectively participate around solutions on the problem? The other thing is, as you know, that one of the other barriers to wider public participation, and that tends to lead to polarization in public views about the issue, is the competing cues or messages that we have from political leaders on either side of the issue. And one of the things in looking at public opinion about climate change over the last 10 years, you can't remove public opinion or even belief in the science from really public evaluations of the 2 leading political leaders relative to that issue, George W. Bush and former Vice President Al Gore. Republicans and conservatives are deservedly blamed for for a lot of their messaging and a lot of their political communication around these issues. As I mentioned earlier, that's downplayed the certainty of the problem and exaggerated the costs of action. But also, if we look at oftentimes our admired political leaders among Democrats in terms of how they've communicated about the problem, you can see that there's very easy cues there for the public to simply choose sides, to rely on their partisanship and simply rely on a very simplistic message either from the right or the left to make up their mind. And this is, I believe, led to a lot of polarization. So if you look at Gore's history of communication about climate change over time, each time he's tried to, I would argue in many cases, try to effectively communicate about the science of climate change, almost consistently he's always paired that message about climate science with a very strong political message. So after losing the election in 2000, the first events he did was with MoveOn.org, where he argued that climate change was a problem. He talked about the science of the issue, but he also linked the issue then to a wider criticism of the Bush administration and things like the policy relative to either the economy or the war in Iraq. And then when in Inconvenient Truth, when he released Inconvenient Truth in 2006, he became sort of a celebrity, a political celebrity at the time. His public evaluations, these are trends in terms of asking the public how they rate each one of these individual leaders over time. His public approval ratings were at an all-time high right around the time that he shared the Nobel Peace Prize with IPCC scientists. And what's interesting is that not only do we tend to overlook that in 2006 and 2007, these were historic or relatively unique years in terms of unemployment and the performance of the economy. These were also relatively unique years in terms of the political mood of the country. The political mood of the country was definitely left of center at that time. In 2006, Nancy Pelosi and Democrats were elected to majority in the House. And before we started talking about Barack Obama as a political celebrity and as a candidate for president on the Democratic side, we were talking about Al Gore. In fact, Time magazine ran a cover story, The Last Temptation of Al Gore, will he run for president or not? But today, if you look at the public ratings of both Bush and Gore, they're exactly about the same level. About 45% of the public has a favorable opinion of either Gore or Bush. And when these questions were asked in 2007, a similar level of public had a proportion of the public had a favorable opinion of Sarah Palin. So one of the problems is that at a political level, just at a heuristic level, how many members of the public who are otherwise disengaged about this issue, they haven't heard a lot about the science, they haven't paid a lot of attention to it, one of the easy shortcuts for them to make up their minds about the issue are the most visible political leaders on the topic. And so today, more than half the country has an unfavorable opinion of Gore, who's the person most widely associated in many members of the public's mind, both with climate science and with policy action. And that remains a challenge in terms of communicating, especially in certain regions of the country, about the problem. And then finally, as a community of people, as scientists, as environmentalists, as people working in related fields who are trying to communicate about climate change and think about what are the barriers to action, we often run up against our own perceptual filters, our own challenges related to identity. And one of those perceptual filters is that the community of people that historically have been working on climate change, for the most part, are fairly one-sided in their political views. One of the things that I look at in the Climate Shift report is I take a representative sample, a survey that was done of members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This is our largest membership society in terms of a science organization. And among members of AAAS, more than half of members of AAAS, roughly 55%, place themselves to either the left of moderate or independent. So about 55% self-identify as liberal, and about 55% self-identify as Democrat. For those of us that work in these communities, that might not sound like too disproportionate. But when we compare this to the rest of the general public or to other major social groups that we're trying to communicate with, we come from the issue, we view the world politically very differently from many of the audiences that we're trying to engage. So here you see on this scale where you have a percentage Republican at the top and percentage Democrat at the bottom, percentage liberal, percentage conservative. AAAS members are way down here in terms of their political composition, sort of their like-mindedness in terms of political views. Here you have Daily Show viewers, New York Times readers, CNN viewers, MSNBC viewers, and black church members. Up there, those are many of the groups that we're trying to engage on the issue. These are many of the groups oftentimes that are in the doubtful or the dismissive category, way up here. So you have Wall Street Journal readers, Fox News viewers, Tea Party members, and Mormon church members. In communicating about climate change, we need to give more consideration from where we're coming from politically as a community, those of us that are concerned and want to see action. And we have to seek out partners from other political communities that might not share our identity, because those partners are often the best opinion leaders to engage with these other social groups that are very different in their political outlook. And we also have to consider how, in many cases, the policy solutions that we might not think much about, such as cap and trade, because we have strong environmental values, because we have a left-leaning political identity, we might not consider cap and trade, we might not reflect that much in terms of how cap and trade might match up to our political identity. For people up here, cap and trade is perceived very differently. And again, a lot of the research shows that you can't disaggregate how people view the science of climate change from the policy solutions that have been proposed. And people often argue against a policy solution they view as hostile to their political identity by rejecting the science. And we see that in good experimental research and others. And I can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested in that. Okay, so those are some of the structural problems, and those are some of the perceptual problems. How do we start to move to a place where we can restart a conversation about climate change that moves beyond sort of the historic political polarization? It might actually present a context for conversation that the public might not have thought about relative to climate change before, but helps them recognize how climate change relates to their daily lives and things that they value. One of the areas of research that I think is very useful from the social science is an area of research called framing. This research on framing cuts across several different disciplines, including social psychology and sociology. But one of the early research in the 1970s was done by two social psychologists, Kahneman and Tversky. They ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economics for their research on decision-making under uncertainty. And one of their key findings that they found is, given a lot of complexity and uncertainty, an individual or a member of the public will seek out a certain type of, will readily rely on a certain perceptual context to make sense of that uncertainty. So let me give you an example here. If I put this ambiguous figure on the screen, you might have, many people in the audience might have a different understanding of what it might actually mean, what you might see on the screen. But if I set the context for perception for the ambiguous stimulus as letters, what very quickly might have been uncertain to you now very clearly appears to you as the letter B. Now, if I take the same stimulus, the same figure, and I reset the context for perception away from letters to numbers, in this case a 12 and a 14, what once looked like a B to you is now very clearly the number 13. You can think about climate change as the ultimate ambiguous stimulus for the public. It's a relatively creeping issue. It's difficult to observe in your daily life. You have to rely on media reports or experts oftentimes to tell you that it's happening. And even when a natural disaster or extreme weather happens, you still might be unclear about whether or not it's connected to climate change or not. And in fact, that's one of our major communication challenges, is talking about these focusing events and the relationship to extreme weather. So the public, as I talked about, will rely as a context for perception on the preferred and trusted information sources in the media and the cues from different political leaders, scientists or environmental leaders or conservatives to very quickly make up their minds about the issue. And this is one of the reasons why we have people in the middle on climate change relatively disengaged, and on people on the polar ends in terms of political identity very polarized. So one of the things that I've been working with Ed Maybach at George Mason on is, what are other contexts for perception apart from a traditional discussion or conversation about climate change as being a major environmental threat that might reset the conversation about climate change, especially for those members of the public in the middle that I showed you that are relatively disengaged about it. Consider some of the traditional narratives or stories that we've told about climate change in the past. Perhaps the most prominent narrative story comes from the movie Inconvenient Truth. If you watch the trailer for that movie now, if you go on YouTube and you search Inconvenient Truth, I show this to my students, you'll see that the story that, the lead story of Inconvenient Truth, the lead frame, is really one of impending environmental disaster. The way to dramatize the story of climate change is to look at symbolic species like the polar bear and the threat to polar bear, or as in the poster for Inconvenient Truth, to take a smokestack from a coal-fired power plant and show a plume in the face of a hurricane. So Hurricane Katrina was one of the real dramatizing visuals and depictions that they used in Inconvenient Truth. In fact, the trailer talked about, after showing you a series of these dramatic depictions, that Inconvenient Truth would be the scariest movie you ever see. And in 2006 and 2007, the media really echoed this message. Time magazine, somewhat famously now, had a cover story called "Be Worried, Be Very Worried," and again used sort of the iconic image of the polar bear. We know from research that there's a couple problems, that inconvenient truth mobilized a base of concern, especially among people who politically identified with Gore and had strong environmental values. But when you confront the public with a catastrophe message, a fear appeal, there's a couple problems. One is, we know from research in health communication that if you give people a strongly challenging risk message, but you don't give them anything they can particularly do about that risk, they either reject the message, they move into a form of denial, or they become fatalistic, that it's a problem, but there's nothing we can do about it. The other problem that happened in reaction to inconvenient truth, because some of these impacts related to climate change, such as hurricanes, the error bars of uncertainty are a lot wider than the general phenomena of human-caused climate change itself, is that they're easily countered from conservatives and skeptics as being examples of alarmism. And it shifted debate back into sort of an endless cycle of uncertainty, debating the science. So one of the things that Ed and I have been interested in is, to what degree can you take other types of impacts related to climate change that might actually get beyond sort of this polarized debate and also connect the issue to chronic things that people are familiar with. And one of those contexts is to talk about the health impacts of climate change. And particularly the health impacts that are related to chronic problems that people are familiar with, like allergies, especially allergies is a major problem in this area, asthma, or vulnerability to extreme heat. When you start to do that, not only are you connecting the issue to something that people are already very familiar with and concerned about, but you're also shifting the geographic location of these impacts from polar regions, in the face of these impacts, say, from animal species, to suburbs and cities. And the face of these impacts ends up being human beings, and oftentimes children, women, and minorities, which in survey research, especially for minorities, tend to be the people that are most disengaged on the issue. But there's one challenge in doing this, that is just like with environmental impacts, you can go too far. How do you get this communication right where you don't take health impacts and move into a fear appeal? And so this is an example of a cover story from Discover magazine in December of last year, where they talk about the coming plague. The coming plague, this magazine cover is very similar to the Time magazine cover here. This is an extreme environmental threat or catastrophe. Here's an extreme health impact or catastrophe. The interesting thing is that the feature article that was Discover magazine, was very substantive. I thought it did a good job of talking about the range of impacts. But whoever's the graphic artist and the editors decided, well, if we're going to get people's attention, we need to go with a fairly dramatized portrayal of these risks. And I would argue that's a problem. So in our research, Ed and I have been trying to look at, again, relying on the National Representative Survey data that Ed and Tony Lacerowitz have done over the last few years, to understand, especially within these categories of people here, how do they react and how do they respond to information about the risks of the health risks of climate change, and then importantly, policy actions, mitigation-related actions that would have co-benefits to public health, especially at the local or the community level. So to start out with our research, 2 summers ago with graduate students, we went to the National Mall. I think we did this in early June. So as you know, the National Mall is a place that from people all over the country come to the National Mall. And as people were walking by, we asked them, do you want to participate in a survey about climate change? If they said yes, we asked them to fill out a 15-item questionnaire. That 15-item questionnaire placed them reliably and validly into one of the 6 audience segments that I've been talking about and I just showed you. If these individuals were within one of the audience segments that we were looking for in terms of fill out our survey, they were then asked to step around the corner to the sculpture garden at the Hirshhorn Museum, and they were paid $50 to sit with us and answer in an open-ended way questions about their attitudes, their beliefs, their knowledge, and their preferences about what should be done on climate change. Importantly, and through this process, by the way, we had interviews from people from 29 different states, and I'll talk about some of the representativeness of the sample that we pulled. But at the end of that survey, we then presented them with a 1-page essay. This is the type of essay, it was formulated like you would read a news article or information that you might find at, say, the NOAA site or the Centers for Disease Control. In the first part of this essay, they were presented with information about the risks, the health risks related to climate change. In the second part of the essay, they presented with information about actions that really at the community or regional level that would lead to mitigation, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also have benefits to public health, individual and collective benefits to public health. As they read across the essay, they had a green marker and a red marker. Anything that they found especially useful or compelling, any sentence or phrase, they were asked to mark in green. Anything that they found confusing or not useful, they were asked to mark in red. And at the end of reading the essay, then we asked them, well, what did you think of the essay? And to tell us in an open-ended way what they thought. We took their comments and we coded them from being 1, positive comments, 0, neutral, -1 being negative comments, and we looked at, on average, what was the valence, what was the direction of these comments across groups. Not surprisingly, those people in the alarmed and the concerned segments reacted very favorably to information about the health risks of climate change and what could be done. But importantly, in the disengaged segments, even the doubtful segment, on average, they're at least neutral or in the positive direction. But what's interesting is that those in the dismissive section, those people who are strongly dismissive of climate change, even when information about climate change was presented in a health context, they strongly started to counter-argue against any information, saying that climate change was a hoax, it wasn't a problem, we don't need to do anything about it. And then on average, extrapolating this out to a population mean, on average there was a positive response across the 6 audience segments. More importantly, we then took the number of times each sentence or phrase across the essay, these are the individual sentences across the essay, each time they were marked in green, we took that total and subtracted from it the number of times within the segment each sentence was marked in red. And so what we have is a sort of a literal response. As person is reading across the essay, are they finding the information useful and compelling, or are they finding the information confusing or not useful? And what's interesting is that for the alarmed and the cautious and the concerned, they had a strongly positive reaction to presentations about the risks of climate change. But when they got to the end, when we talked about mitigation-related actions at the community level that had benefits to public health, the reactions went up even more in terms of finding that information compelling and useful. This is the disengaged, the dismissives, and the doubtfuls. When they were being presented with information about the health risks of climate change, especially the doubtfuls and the dismissives, the reaction was very negative. But at the end, when we talked about mitigation-related actions that had benefits to public health, they found that information very compelling and very useful on average, with one exception that I'll come back to in a second. So here's the results of what we found in doing this survey. Everyone, all 6 audience segments, agreed strongly with the statement that good health is a blessing. Public health is a value, unlike, unfortunately, the environment, that tends to transcend political differences and identities. All 6 Americas embraced mitigation actions that had public health benefits. So these actions include clean energy sources and more efficient energy use, lead to healthier air to breathe, improving the design of our cities and towns for walking, biking, and mass transit, will reduce cars and help people be more active and lose weight, taking actions to limit global warming by making our energy sources cleaner and our appliances more efficient, by making our cities and towns friendly to trains, buses, and bikers, walkers, and by improving the quality and safety of our food will improve the health of every American. Whether you're doubtful, dismissive, alarmed, or concerned, or somewhere in between, on average, all 6 audience segments could agree with these statements or found them compelling and useful. The one statement that all 6 audience segments tended to argue against, that did not find useful or compelling, was any suggestion that they change their diet. So the suggestion that increasing our consumption of fruits and vegetables and decreasing our intake of meat, especially beef, will help people keep a healthy weight, will help prevent heart disease and cancer, and will play an important role in limiting global warming, everyone tended to rate that somewhat negatively. Now, what's interesting is we published this study at BMC Public Health, which is an open access journal published in Britain, and a public health professional from California read the article and emailed us saying, you know, I found the article very useful, but did you consider this is the one recommendation that you gave that was individually focused, whereas all these other recommendations related to health are really collectively focused. These are things that government would do or institutions would do. These are things that an individual would do. If you rephrase this as, for example, making fruits and vegetables cheaper through subsidies and other things, would you have a different reaction instead of making it as a personal recommendation? We said, aha, you're right. This is something we should have thought of. None of the reviewers caught it. This is something we tell our students, but this is one reason why I think open access publication is interesting. But the takeaway here is before we start to engage people on changes to their diet or the food system, We need a lot more research on how people understand the relationship between the food system and climate change and how changes might lead to benefits. Because if we start to lead with these types of recommendations, as some activists do, I think it's a really easy way to turn off members of the public across all audience segments. So what Ed and I have been doing is that we've been taking this research that we've been doing over the last couple of years, and we recently released a primer. One of the important things about widening public engagement is to seek out other opinion leaders, other organizations, other institutions that can also effectively communicate about climate change. And one of those segments, one of those stakeholder groups are health professionals and public health agencies and organizations. The only problem is that, as Ed finds in some of his research, is that many public health professionals and agencies they know that climate change is a health risk, but they don't know much about what these risks might be, and they don't necessarily know how to engage the public, how to effectively provide this information. So one of the communication challenges first is to engage the stakeholder, this important partner in communicating about climate change, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do in releasing this primer, this backgrounder on what the health risks are and how to effectively engage your community. One of the other things that we're looking at, though, is you can't talk about climate change or think about climate change without thinking about energy insecurity. And one of the interesting things is we have a study coming out with Tony Lasarowitz also from in the American Journal of Public Health, is we try to begin to ask people what they think about the possibility of peak petroleum. You can't ask people about peak petroleum because they haven't heard about that problem. So we ask people instead, trying to get their latent sense of what their concerns about peak petroleum might be, is we first ask people, how likely do you think it will be that gas prices will triple over the next 5 years? And if they do triple, how harmful would it be to the economy and how harmful it would be to public health? What's really interesting about this survey is that those people who are strongly dismissive about climate change out here, in terms of recognizing the potential for gas prices to triple, recognizing the harmful impacts to the economy and the harmful impacts to health, they're more concerned about that problem. A majority of them are concerned about that problem, believe it would be harmful to health and the economy, more concerned than people who are alarmed about climate change. So this signifies to me that we need a lot more research. I think one of the problems is we tend to do a lot of research on the psychology of denial. Why are people in denial? But I often think that research doesn't really tell us a lot about how to actually engage them and get them to participate around solutions. One of the ways is to understand more effectively how is it that this other segment of the public, why are they so concerned about energy insecurity, and how can they be engaged on that concern around areas that would solve both the energy security problem, but also begin to address climate change as well. And so I think that a lot more research is needed in that area. Okay, so one of the important things to remember about framing is that framing is not about, in politics we tend to think about framing as persuasion, as sort of top-down message effects. But really when we're thinking about trying to widen public participation, we should think about framing as the context that we set for conversation. The only way to effectively engage people is to engage them over time through a social process. And framing is a social process. It sets the context for perception, but importantly, it sets the context for conversation. This is a place through these conversations in terms of discussing climate change as an environmental problem, discussing climate change as a public health problem, as an agricultural issue, as an economic development or economic impacts problem, a national security problem. These are not messages. We should not think about these as persuasion tools, but really we should think about these as deliberative tools. How do we think about how if we reset the context for discussion and deliberation across different groups and across different social spaces, from churches to malls to community groups, how does that help people sort out their differences, come to recognize their shared interests, and come together around solutions and to actively participate? And I've argued in some articles that we should think about universities across the country, especially land-grant universities, as not only hubs for research, but also hubs for public engagement and deliberation. And one of the ways that we should think about universities in this way is to try to facilitate truly multidisciplinary collaborations among university researchers and departments and with community stakeholders around public engagement with climate change. So currently, we have a lot of relationships and partnerships among the social sciences and the environmental sciences, either in terms of understanding how to communicate the problem or in terms of policy evaluation or economic evaluation. But if we're going to be really effective public engagers, if universities are going to become hubs for public engagement, we need to bring in the other disciplines. Philosophy, religion, and moral philosophy. This really provides the meaning to our lives and how we understand society. in terms of human beings and social beings. The creative arts and the professions, these are the dominant storytellers of a lot of these lives. These are the Steven Spielbergs, these are the Norman Rockwells. They take a lot of things from science and from moral philosophy, and they weave them into compelling stories that move people to action and help them recognize their understanding. So how is it that we get people at universities that tend to be fairly balkanized places and siloed, as some of you know, how do we get them to collaborate on public engagement initiatives? Well, it starts with funding. And one of the things that I've suggested is that we rethink how, when science grants go to a university, each grant has a broader impacts mission with it, as some of you that know have worked with government agencies before. Well, if we took each one of those portions of public impacts mission from a grant and we pooled it at a university level, say at George Mason or Maryland University, and then through a multidisciplinary panel and also stakeholders from that community, we then made decisions about, in partnership with things like government agencies and other institutions in a region, how do we systematically invest those resources around public engagement in one or two initiatives that bring about best practices and achieve certain types of normative and effective goals. So that's one start. The other start is to really think about the only way to, as I talk about, we have these structural barriers in the media system. A lot of those structural barriers are in terms of attention. Some of those structural barriers are in terms of polarization. But we also have community barriers. There are very few places, there are very few social spaces where people can come together to have an engaged conversation, oftentimes with ideally with non-like-minded others. So there's a lot of research, as I started at the opening to this topic, about how do you facilitate effective public meetings. This is an example from the Worldwide Views on Global Warming. This was an initiative that was held just before the Copenhagen meetings in Denmark, and it was held in 40 countries across the world, where in a region or a city, they brought together 100 people that was attempted to be representative sample of people in that region. And what's interesting is that in the room they had no expert. There's no person on a stage lecturing to this audience. Instead, you have a professional facilitator at the front of the room, and then each one of these tables, as you see here, also had a professional facilitator. The people who were participating in these meetings had background materials provided in advance. They also had background materials at the table. But the conversation was facilitated around how do we understand climate change? How is it relevant to our lives or to our communities? And then in terms of a menu of things, what should be done? And at the end of this consultation, this public meeting, at the end of 2 days, the participants all voted on what they think should happen, what the priorities should be and should happen at the Copenhagen meetings. And then this was released across 40 countries in advance of the Copenhagen meetings as a way, ideally, to inform the members. But as a structure, this is a very interesting form of how to think about public deliberation and public engagement. But we need to think more concretely and more systematically about how can we facilitate these types of social spaces and opportunities across communities across the country. But we also need to line up these types of public engagement, face-to-face, real-world public engagement initiatives with thinking about how do we subsidize the capacity of the media system to present information about climate change and energy, especially at the regional and the local level. We often tend to think about the media in terms of messages, but really the media is an important part of the infrastructure that we need to solve collective problems on any issue, but especially on climate change in the environment or on energy. So this is one way I would map out how to do this. I'm from upstate New York, and I was giving a talk at Cornell a couple of weeks ago. But again, we should think about universities as being news providers. In fact, this is already happening on things like investigative journalism, community journalism, but partnerships among universities within a region that is grant supported from the government and from foundations and also from resources from the universities themselves, I think can be very effective in starting what I call digital news communities. These are communities that provide independently, professionally produced news and information about climate and energy in that region. You hire a news editor, you have a freelance budget, you have student journalists working on working to contribute stories. You can have RSS feeds you can take from university magazines, you can take from the University Research News Service, you can take the NOAA magazine where you have national science and news or regional news, and you can have shared content there where it's also featured at this digital news space. And you map this digital news community onto the real world events that are going on within that region, either a single state or a number of states. And then you syndicate for free that content that's produced at the digital news community to newspapers within the region. So for example, in upstate New York, one of the interesting things is that the Buffalo News, the Syracuse Post-Standard, and the Rochester Democrat, They don't have the capacity really to cover the climate and energy issues in that area, yet they have some of the highest penetration rates in terms of readership in the country. So if you're living, what that means is that according to the studies that they've done, 90% of the people in these communities, if they read a newspaper, they read the Buffalo News. Or if they're living in Syracuse, they read the Syracuse News. They don't, the Syracuse Post-Standard. They don't read the USA Today. They don't read the Wall Street Journal. They don't read the New York Times. They're turning to their local newspaper. There's a strong relationship there and a bond. But those newspapers are not presenting them with localized climate and energy information. If you think about a digital news community in this way, and also sharing and syndicating content to local newspapers and also public media organizations that are becoming digital hubs for news and information, you start to solve some of these infrastructure problems that we have in terms of effectively widening public participation on the issue. And then finally, we have to think more about everyday opinion leaders. Everyday opinion leaders who are either opinion leaders when it comes to public affairs, news and information, or opinion leaders on climate and energy. There's about 60 years of research on who opinion leaders are. Opinion leaders are people across every social demographic who pay closer attention to an issue, and we all know who these people are. You yourselves might be among these people. They pay very close information to a specific topic. Their friends and colleagues turn to them for information and advice, and they have a strength of personality and a know-how to pass on information very effectively and to be persuasive. So in thinking about the communication infrastructure that we need to facilitate wider public engagement, we need to think about real-world spaces, public engagement, public meetings. We need to think about the news media system in terms of providing the infrastructure through the news media system that provides information to people so they can participate and have decisions. And then we need to think about the informal communication infrastructure, which is really sort of the social fabric of everyday opinion leaders who we can identify and we can recruit and we can train them to facilitate conversations among other people about climate and energy and bring people out to meetings like this. And again, you can hook them up then in today's world to things like iPhone apps and social media. They can become that much more effective in terms of coordinating what they do and having information available to them as they're talking to someone. Imagine you're talking to someone about climate change. They don't really understand what you're talking about, but you had a short little video you could flip around on your iPhone and show them a 45-second video or a minute-long video that explains to them the health impacts of climate change or what the drivers of climate change might be. So you're really amplifying in terms of personal influence, trust, but then also media when you start to think about iPhone apps. And the iPhone apps become an information source for opinion leaders themselves. They can quickly look up information. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to leave you with a picture of one of my favorite places, which is Acadia National Park, looking down on Bar Harbor. And if you want to find out more information about the research that we're doing at American University on climate change and energy in this report that I released a couple of weeks ago, along with many of the other studies that we're doing, just go to climateshiftproject.org. Thanks. I think one of the issues is that we've put a lot of attention policy-wise and communication-wise in terms of putting a price on carbon and making dirty fuels more expensive, but we haven't focused nearly as much on even if you put a price on carbon, as you say, you want Chinese who are going to drive Buicks. Where does the technology and where does the know-how come from in terms of transitioning both the technology and the adoption of that technology in terms of transitioning to cleaner fuel sources? And I think until a couple of years ago, the assumption always was that, and this was actually an assumption that was featured in Gore's movie, is that we have all the technology we need to solve the problem. And now no one agrees with that statement. You can't find a person that would agree with that statement. And so I think in combination with thinking about things like limiting emissions, we really need, as a public opinion researcher, I'm really interested in figuring out how to more effectively communicate about the role of government in funding research and innovation. And for conservatives, I think even in today's budgetary world, at least among intellectual conservatives, this might be changing because the Heritage Foundation released a report contrary to this. But I think there is, the National Academy's reports, Rising Above the Gathering Storm. I think that's an interesting message that Obama featured in a State of the Union speech about, while thinking about the problem of regulating greenhouse gas emissions, we also have to simultaneously do more communication and policy work and thinking about the innovation challenge. And from a public opinion standpoint, I'm really interested in how does the public understand the value of the government investing in R&D and investing in things like universities and also education. Because I think that's going to be a real challenge point in an era of very fixed budgets or declining budgets. Yeah, I mean, I think there's two issues there on education. I think one is, the more and more I work on this, I mean, I started out doing this in graduate school. I thought about communication as a message process, and now I really see it as a social process that's really structurally based. And one of those structural barriers I didn't talk about is rethinking education. Especially the one place that we can make the most immediate change would be at the university level or the college level, where we think in science education courses more along the lines of what are the civic components of these science education courses that we can introduce to students about how to use the media system effectively, how to think about the roles as citizens, how to understand the political and social dimensions of these issues. So we're sort of socializing and cultivating the next generation of citizens who not only think about, say, taxes and the economy as a political issue, as one that they can participate on, but importantly, science issues as well. But that's a separate question. I think there is a lot of work going on in terms of dietary choices, and the First Lady is doing a lot of that. And maybe perhaps it will change generationally how people think about their dietary choices indirectly related to meat versus produce, which then might shape consumption patterns. I don't know, but I think that's something to think about. I think there's emerging work by policy experts who, question, whether the UN is the right institution to try to broker cooperative global efforts around. And people have argued, for example, that we should really think about, multi-state agreements among the biggest emitters. That's where we can make the most progress politically in terms of agreements, and then agreements between the U.S. and China instead of trying to get all countries to sign on a single agreement. I think that's where things are headed, or to get people to agree around things like emissions related to methane or to black soot. That might give us more time to make progress. But in terms of public opinion, I haven't seen a lot of work in terms of how people think about what the impact of working through the UN, because Americans are strongly distrustful of the UN, so it has probably impacted public opinion in the past. I haven't seen a lot of work on that, but I have seen work on cap and trade, where it's fairly clear that a lot of people's doubts about climate science are really indirect opinions about the policy solutions they see attached to that science. And when you see something, if you're a conservative or you believe, you have a very strong belief in free markets, you're skeptical about big government or what you see as bureaucratic approaches. For conservatives, they could take cap and trade and fold it very effectively into a larger message about big government, even Obamacare. And the easiest way to argue against a policy like that is to say that there's no problem and to reject the science. And some of the work, if you look at the work by the Cultural Cognition Project at Yale University, they find this: the people that score high on values called hierarchical or individualist values, which tend to map onto conservative values, when they're presented with scientific information and then the policy solution is something like cap and trade, they reject that scientific information about climate change. But when they're presented with a policy solution such as providing tax benefits or incentives to expand nuclear energy, for example, so something that is an incentive towards industry, they readily accept. They're much more likely to accept the information about climate science under that context. And that's sort of the policy-dependent nature of perceptions of science. Science is not communicated in a vacuum. There's a lot of things going on there, and you can't disentangle people's perceptions of the science from the policy solutions that have been proposed or the political leaders who have been advocating for those solutions. Well, there's two ways. So one is the one what I showed you in terms of the amount of attention. Those are opinion articles or news articles at those newspapers or news organizations that have climate change or global warming in the headline or lead paragraph. And then the graduate students, there's something like 1,800 articles there. And there's a little bit more over 2,000 that were first identified through an online database called LexisNexis. So graduate students read through all the articles. They rejected the articles. They took out the articles that were non-relevant after reading through them after the first search return. And then those were put into a database, and then we sampled 1 out of 4 every articles, a representative sample of 25%. And then 3 graduate students were trained to reliably and validly rate those articles very simply on whether or not the article presented the consensus view that climate change is real and it's human caused, a falsely balanced view that we don't know, that there's these 2 competing viewpoints, or the dismissive view that it's not real or it's not human caused, it's a natural cycle. And then they rated each, and then what I showed you then was the statistical results in terms of the proportion that reflected each one of those categories. So I can talk to you more about how that process works, but the really interesting thing would be to look at, I have data on local newspapers in Michigan, West Virginia, and South Carolina, and I'm analyzing that data now and during the same years. And my expectation is there's a lot less attention overall to climate change. Most of that climate change news was national and probably syndicated. And during those key years in these political states and politically important states, it's interesting. It will be interesting to see how the science was portrayed, and also in terms of just how much local or regional information people had about climate change while decisions were happening at the international and national level, because that speaks to this infrastructure problem I was talking about. First of all, if you go to, if you just Google global warming 6 Americas, you'll go right to the report. It'll take you right to the PDF. And the cautious group, on average, tends to be disproportionately women who are non-college educated. And what's interesting is that people in these groups, they don't have a strong political identity. So in the cautious group, they tend to be moderate to independent, but political identity is not a big feature for them. And they're not strong news consumers either. So here you have more disproportionately low-income individuals that are more minority. Here you have people who, in terms of gender, are disproportionately women, tend to be political independents, and are not college educated. These are major swing voters in every election, by the way. These are the people that Hillary Clinton and Obama were competing over during the primaries, Democratic primary. And so their sources of information are probably local television news. That's probably their #1 source of news and information if they are paying attention, if they are watching local television. So Ed Maybach, for example, is working on a project where he's trying to work with weathercasters to give them better tools and training for when talking about the weather, also to provide during that short 90-second period of time good information about how the weather might relate to climate or localized regional related impacts. And I think that's a really innovative way to think about how to reach these people, because you're not going to reach them through, they're not watching Fox News, they're not watching CNN. They may be reading their daily newspaper, but most likely if they are getting news and information, they're getting it through local television news. The other way to reach these people is through everyday opinion leaders, conversation partners, people at work, at school, or in their neighborhood who you've identified and you've engaged with, you've trained, and they strike up a personal conversation with them, and they bring them out to events like this. So the interpersonal sources and then the local television news sources are probably the best way to reach them. Well, the first question is a good one. I think we're stuck with both terms. We're not going to change the terms. Some people have argued that we should be talking about things like other terms like well, I forget the terms now, but something like climate catastrophe, or Al Gore, for example, talks about it as the climate crisis. But we're pretty much stuck with climate change and global warming. But a paper I just reviewed actually did a survey actually using this audience segmentation tool, and interestingly enough, the alarmed, their preferred term was global warming, which a scientist would argue, well, that's not the scientifically correct term. And among the dismissive, their preferred term was climate change. The other thing that you find in some of the surveys is that both groups have equal levels of self-knowledge. So if you ask people, how much do you know about climate change? Both alarmed and dismissive say, well, I know a lot. How certain are your opinion? They're very certain. Do you need any more information? They tend to say no. So each side is equally convinced that they know what's going on. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to engage with the dismissives. Now, when it comes to selective online information sources, the people that's most relevant for, again, are these two people here. These are the people that have the motivation to be seeking out that information in the first place. And they're also the people, the alarmed and the dismissives, who have the strong political identity and attachment to the issue. So on both sides, this fragmentation, this ideological fragmentation of the media is a big problem. On the dismissive side, their doubts and their disbelief are constantly reinforced either by only watching Fox News or listening to political talk radio or seeking out skeptical blogs or conservative blogs. But on the alarm side, we have a different problem where the complexity of climate change politics, here the complexity of climate science is dramatically reduced for people down to a dismissive perspective. But here on the alarm side, we have a tendency to reduce down the complexity of climate change politics and communication to a single problem, which are deniers and the conservative media like Fox News. And we overlook a whole range of other factors that might actually be more prominent, more influential, things like the economy or simply how we framed the issue and communicated about the issue in the past as only an environmental problem. And blogs and left-leaning media and commentators tend to reinforce that the real problem is the deniers, and it makes us overlook as a community engaging these people here in the middle. So, and it deflects, among this community, it deflects attention or shields them from considering, for example, was cap and trade the right policy to approach? And if you go to climateshiftproject.org, that's one of the things that I focus on in the report that I released. There's two ways to jumpstart that. One is to put a price on carbon, which we haven't been able to do, and two is the role of government in investing in technology creation, innovation, and job growth, and also incentives. So I would argue that, and this would be an interesting study to try to look at, but my sense is that the stimulus plan, Obama's stimulus plan that provided tax credits for home energy efficiency use, something like that, a stimulus plan like that, is probably the most effective communication campaign we've ever done about energy, because there's direct incentives for people to pay attention. Not only that, it's a huge catalyst to local media coverage, and coverage that's not in the science or environment pages, but is in fact actually sort of the news to use, local TV news segments, the household living section of a newspaper, and then personal conversations. A lot of opinion leaders activated talking up about the tax rebates you could get for winterizing or making your home more efficient. So that's one of the roles of government that we often overlook, both in terms of providing the incentives for social change, but also as being a communication tool. And that's why I'm really interested in doing more work and understanding how the public values the role of government in those types of situations. So, thank you.